This video is brought to you by GreenManGaming. You can use the link provided in the description to pick up Battlefield 2042 for 12% off. And be sure to check out their website for other great deals this holiday season. Welcome back everybody to another episode of Direct Comparison. In today's episode, we're going to take an in-depth look at the recently released Battlefield 2042 and see how it compares from a purely technical perspective to the previous mainline entry to the series, Battlefield 5. For this analysis, both games are being played on the PC, with the graphical settings cranked up to their highest settings at a 4K resolution. However, for at least most of this video, I'll be running both games with their RTX specific features like ray traced reflections or ambient occlusion disabled, and I'll re-enable them when specifically covering the lighting design. Also, as I'm already covering the entire Battlefield franchise in exhaustive detail for my upcoming documentary, I want to spend this video speaking purely about the visual effects of these two games, as opposed to going into the nitty-gritty about each available feature and gameplay mechanic. But rest assured, all of that will be covered in my History of Battlefield project that's set to release in the next couple of weeks. So let's kick this comparison off by first talking about some of the shared weapon models in both games, which, thanks to the recreated Battlefield 1942 content offered in the new Portal mode, makes this a bit easier. First, we have the Germans' STG assault rifle. Right away, you should be able to notice a few key differences. The first and most obvious difference is that the snow and dirt decal effects no longer accumulate on the player's weapon in 2042. Additionally, the metal surface textures aren't quite as reflective, even when the ray tracing is disabled in Battlefield 5. And the few reflective surfaces that are still visible have a very dithered appearance to them, almost as if the screen space reflections use a lower resolution. When we zoom in a bit closer though, there's a few improvements offered with 2042's model in regards to the small weapon details. You'll find many of these circular pieces have an increased poly count, making them appear more properly rounded, and things like the serial number along the receiver are much smaller, but yet more crisp. This is an observation that can be made across practically every shared weapon in these two games, with 2042's weapons sporting superior textures and poly counts. But without the proper lighting effects to help portray these improvements, the end result is a much less impressive image overall. And so weapons like the MP40, Kar 98, the BAR, and especially the M1 Garand all appear like a noticeable step backwards visually. Next up, let's talk about the environments. Now, here's where things get a little bit more interesting. If you didn't already know, 2042, while primarily based on a semi-futuristic atmosphere, also offers several recreations of classic maps from fan-favorite Battlefield entries. This includes 2 maps from Bad Company 2, 2 maps from Battlefield 3, and 2 maps from the original Battlefield 1942. These last 2 maps are some of the more interesting maps in the collection, as they haven't been featured in the series since they debuted back in 2002. And with the help of the newer Frostbite engine, they're now both fully realized, with rich detail, huge draw distances, and the series' signature dynamic destruction effects. And because Battlefield 5's level assets match the theme of these recreated locations, there's several returning building models, trees, and other objects to help bring these locations back into action, most notably this windmill structure. However, because these maps are built around the core map design of levels from nearly 20 years ago, there isn't really the same kind of general infantry balance and flow that you'd expect from a more modern Battlefield map design. Most paths to and from objectives are large, wide-open fields, with little to no cover for players running around on foot, encouraging squads to make use of vehicles whenever possible. There's still a ton of changes veteran players will run into, like an increased number of buildings with full interiors, and some massive dunes out in the desert of El Alamein. But you're still going to want to grab a tank or plane before heading out of any major objective. Battlefield 5, on the other hand, has much more infantry-focused maps overall, with narrow lanes too tight for vehicles to effectively maneuver through. Even the more vehicle-centric maps like Panzerstorm have at least some areas that favor infantry combat to some degree, which all makes sense considering map design philosophy has evolved significantly over this series' history. Though, thankfully, players in 2042 aren't just limited to these 2 old 1942 maps. There's over a dozen maps for players to battle across, with plenty of variety in playstyles thanks to the inclusion of Bad Company 2 and Battlefield 3 maps, and all of them can be played with 1942 soldiers and vehicles if the server's set up that way. As for the actual visual quality of these environments, the texture maps and general environmental terrain complexity seems to favor the newer 2042 in most areas, as the various surfaces of Battlefield 5 have a very low-res appearance to them. This isn't necessarily always the case, as there are some structures and models that look great in BF5. And in these cases, there's really no clear advantage one way or the other. Next, we have lighting. The lighting in Battlefield 2042 is both great and disappointing at the same time. In some maps, it does look fantastic, bringing out great specular effects along water-soaked concrete and dynamically changing to account for the new weather effects. But then there's other maps like the ones in Portal that can kinda go either way. The 1942 maps in particular aren't all that impressive, with the Battle of the Bulge feeling generally dull and muted. El Alamein, on the other hand, has this extremely bright haze to it that feels excessive, especially when it's coupled with all these post-processing effects to simulate this glow on every object in the world. Speaking of which, 2042 currently has this really bad visual glitch involving its alpha effects when cast behind object models, giving everything this sort of weird light outline, an issue that I wasn't able to reproduce in Battlefield 5. Meanwhile, Battlefield 5's lighting still holds up remarkably well today, with some beautifully lit environments all coupled with some great bloom implementation, specular effects, and advanced ray-traced reflections that are capable of reflecting all major game assets and character models in real time. This latter effect is, of course, hugely demanding on hardware, and I personally disable the feature when actually playing the game, but it is a cool effect nonetheless, and one that I was surprised to see not return in 2042. Though, 2042 does at least offer an improved ambient occlusion method that, while barely noticeable, does technically improve object detail shadowing to some degree. Now, don't get me wrong, the lighting in 2042 still looks great. In fact, many may prefer the lighting design of those 1942 maps that I mentioned, as the lighting design in Battlefield 5 is, more often than not, extremely colorful, almost to a fault. But there's no ignoring the fact that some of these nice reflective surfaces and the lighting that occurred from things like explosions and weapon muzzle flashes were more technically impressive in Battlefield 5. Speaking of which, let's move on and talk about some of the effects, starting with the water simulation. Battlefield 5 offers some really impressive water physics effects, with ripples radiating out from every player-generated projectile and properly moving around players swimming in the water itself. 2042 carries over some aspects of this, but it feels a bit broken at the moment, with some weird artifacting in maps like Battle of the Bulge, and some weak surface level reflections that exasperate the already poor screen space reflections we saw earlier. There's even some areas like this riverbed in Erica Harbor, where bullet projectiles cause jets of water to emit above the surface of the water, an obvious bug that will need to be addressed at some point. Next, there's the explosions. As I mentioned in my previous comparison on the beta for this game, 2042's fireballs are a big improvement over the sort of unusual fireballs we saw in past Battlefield entries. The fire and smoke have this really cool billowing effect now, that you'd expect to see from a real explosion. However, there is still room for improvement, as I feel the lack of dynamic lighting effects really hurts the appearance a great deal, and these odd distorted bubbles representing the shockwave feel like a bit much. On the plus side, the increased particle density and the quality of various alpha effects are a huge improvement over Battlefield 5. And with several of these explosions going off all the time, each battle feels a lot more epic as a result. Which is why it's interesting that Battlefield 2042 doesn't carry over the great ambient particle effects used in BF5 at all. In BF5, levels like Narvik featured occasional snowfall, where snowflakes could accumulate on surfaces and then blow in the wind along the edge. It's a really cool effect, and one that I'm surprised to see isn't included in 2042, even in maps where there is a similar light snowfall. I also discovered that general dynamic destruction isn't quite as effective in 2042, with explosives not creating deep craters in the snow like before. Though it is worth noting that deep craters like these can still be formed using heavy ordnance from vehicles, so it's perhaps more of a balancing design choice. It could also be a result of the game's new increase to the player count, bumping up the previous standard 64 players up to an incredible 128, transforming every location into complete and utter chaos. This is without a doubt the biggest reason why there's been so many sacrifices to the general visual quality of the game's makeup, as the increased computing power required to handle double the number of online players, or even just the AI-controlled bot soldiers, presents a major technical hurdle to overcome. The fact that the game still manages to look almost as good as Battlefield 5, with this many more soldiers throwing grenades and blowing up walls left to right, is certainly commendable, even if it doesn't really look all that different on the surface. Finally, let's wrap up with a brief sound comparison. Which game do you feel sports the superior audio quality and design? And that wraps up this episode of Direct Comparison. Overall, Battlefield 2042, when compared to its predecessor Battlefield 5, from a purely graphical perspective, seems to be a sizable step backwards. Yes, the weapon models have slightly better geometry, and sure, some of the environmental surfaces have better texture maps, but the lighting design will no doubt stand out considerably to most players, and will greatly limit the potential of any improvements that have been made elsewhere. Also, the effects have quite a few issues at the moment, whether it be the odd shimmer along objects cast against alpha effects, or the artifacting and dithering of the water surface. Battlefield 2042 will need a lot of work to be done under the hood before it can be competitive with the likes of Battlefield 5. That being said, it is worth reiterating that BF 2042's strongest new technical feature is that larger player count that not only looks more impressive, but completely transforms how players actually play the game. So, what do you guys think? Are you okay with those visual sacrifices made in order to justify the larger player count? Or are you leaning more towards Battlefield 5? Let me know in the comment section. Also, if you want to check out 2042 for yourself and want to save 12% on your purchase, be sure to use the link I provided in the description to buy the game through Green Man Gaming. If you're not familiar with them, Green Man Gaming is a 100% legitimate digital distribution retailer, providing all the latest games at great discounts, and providing you with keys that can be redeemed on platforms like Steam, Epic, Uplay, and Origin. And it's not just Battlefield. There's over 9,000 games available on their store from over 800 publishers. And it's also been around for a while too, with over 6 million users having made purchases over the course of the past 10 years, myself included. So if you're looking to bulk up your game library this holiday season, be sure to check out the link in the description. And be sure to stay tuned to this channel for a massive documentary that will cover the entire Battlefield franchise, from its start with Codename Eagle in 1942, all the way through to the most recent release of 2042. And to help tell this huge story, I'll also be joined by several prominent members of the Battlefield community, including Flakfire, Azura, Raycevick, LevelCap, and even the Battlefield friends themselves, NeebsGaming, just to name a few. I'm still editing that project nonstop every day, so for those of you waiting for my analyses on other games like Call of Duty, Forza, and Riders Republic, please bear with me. I will be getting back to my normal schedule once this project is finished. And of course, don't forget to like and subscribe for new content like this posted every week.